impressed me most about Pretty Pickle was how you were able to encapsulate an entire impression of early romance in just a short film. What inspired this story and how did you boil it down to its essence?
I think the kernel of it was more of like this aesthetic idea of I think a lot of like indie rom-coms and sort of like indie deadpan comedies have a certain aesthetic. Like I was thinking a little bit about Francis Ha and Jarmusch's Coffee and Cigarettes, and how I love the visual decision to, shoot in sort of like a more narrow frame or even in black and white, and how there was this overlap between that with some of like my favorite old classic horror films like Night of the Living Dead and Psycho. And narratively, since I was sort of like chewing on this idea that kind of combined both, it sort of made sense to go that route. I had to be economical about it, and part of that was this idea of like challenging myself to um, have like a lot of these scenes of intimacy, whereas normally, there's a criticism that sex scenes in movies are gratuitous and unnecessary and they don't move the plot along. But I really thought about how could I make them useful, and how, it's not about like the male gaze or any kind of gaze so much as it is like how can we develop, like how can we use this as character development and as like narrative forward momentum.
It's also impressively shot in black and white, particularly effective when characters look at our current digital world. How are you and your DP, Chris Rejano, able to get the right tone for the black and white artistry of the story?
From early on, I thought it should be black and white, because of like the inspiration that I mentioned. And, Chris was immediately on board. And the reason I like Chris and sort of like we share a lot of like similar cinematic interests and inspiration, and just like, we like a lot of the same art and pop culture and that kind of thing. We both worked hard at it, but I think it was like kind of this natural synergy of like sort of like arriving on that look.
As a Filipino American, you have a strong philosophy in your person of color representation within your films. In the context of the film, how does your art comment on the white Eurocentric power base, and how does it point out its inevitable weaknesses?
A lot of great horror movies, oftentimes the messaging or the subversive inspiration behind them, often go right over the viewer's head. They're not the main point. Like they're sort of like the kernel from which the narrative stems, but there's also this sort of underlying relatability for a certain subset of viewers of the film, potentially anyway, about having this person of color be suspicious, but also like be insecure about his personal place in the world and not being able to like communicate certain things. What Samuel discovers could, yeah, potentially be read as like this understanding, like having the curtain pulled back to, a world that he lives in and that he interacts and functions in, but is also like, not entirely shown to him. The things you thought you knew versus like how they are.
So, we'll talk about sex. You had sex as a power dynamic between the couple and shot those scenes as a realistic impression between them. As a filmmaker, and given how things have changed in the last 5 years, how do you approach the more nuanced atmosphere in on-set sensitivity to sex scenes?
Knowing what we know now versus like, this pre Weinstein bombshell type environment, I think not only is it critical, but it's also like creatively rewarding in my experience to be able to have such involvement with the talent who is putting themselves out there so vulnerably, and also to have like the crew on set be in on that communication. I just think it makes sense for everybody to have input and awareness, and also just to kind of like have this concerted effort to have everyone who's working on this thing to be on the same page about it. You can walk away knowing you've come upon like the best thing, not just for like the camera and for the audience, but just for like the people that work on it, you know?
Finally, what does the Chicago premiere at Cuff 29 mean to you? And what are you excited to show this local audience?
Um, yeah, well, you know, Cuff is has a special place in my heart because they are the first film festival ever to have shown anything when I was just like you know nothing kid in my early 20s. You know, I made this like short on digital video. They loved it. They championed it. Like, this is my fourth time screening with them. I love to be able to like keep coming back to like show my work, and I love that you know, it's kind of had this homecoming where my whole crew was local. So everybody, you know, some folks are working, but like most of my crew will be in attendance. So it's kind of like this nice payoff for not just like an audience who has not been involved with the process, but even just the people that have not seen it yet, who, you know, worked on this film like 6 months ago.
This is Patrick McDonald for HollywoodChicago.com. Copyright 2022.